Okay, so let's talk tariffs, right? This is, it's been the big story lately. I mean, how can you ignore it?
Yeah, it's been pretty unavoidable.
I mean, you've got President Trump rolling out these pretty major tariffs back in February, and
Yeah.
you have 25% on stuff coming in from Canada and Mexico.
Right.
And then the China tariffs, those started at 10%, and then just like that boom up to 20%.
Yeah, doubled right out of the gate.
Yeah, exactly. And then you throw on top of that a 10% tariff on energy coming from Canada. And, you know, when you think about it, over 40% of everything the U.S. imported last year
Wow.
came from those three countries. I mean, that's
a huge chunk.
it's a huge chunk, yeah. And then, you know, of course, the market reacted right March 11th. We saw that little wobble. I think investors are maybe a little spooked about certain sectors,
Yeah.
you know, the ones that are really tied to these imports,
Right.
especially where there's, you know, that, what do they call it, that elasticity,
Yeah, elastic demand.
where people can just, you know, switch to a different product if the price gets too high.
Exactly. I mean, that market reaction, I think that speaks volumes, right? It shows you how sensitive things are
Yeah.
to these kinds of, you know, interventions in trade. And what I found really fascinating was just how quickly that anxiety, you know, that worry translated into market activity.
Yeah.
It's like they were anticipating these disruptions that could be coming.
Yeah, for sure. So what we want to do today in this deep dive is really kind of dissect this whole tariff thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do they actually do? Do they work? How have they played out historically? And we're going to look at this other tool that governments use as well,
Yeah.
subsidies.
Yeah.
How do those fit in? Because, you know, it just feels incredibly relevant right now with all these new tariffs, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
So-
Yeah, the timing couldn't be better.
Shaking things up.
Yeah.
So before we get into all the nitty gritty, I think it's good to take a step back and just remind ourselves, like, why do we even have free trade in the first place?
Right. Well, I mean, the core idea is this concept of comparative advantage, and it goes all the way back to Ricardo.
Ricardo, right?
The basic principle is that countries benefit the most when they focus on producing the things they're really good at, you know, the stuff they can make most efficiently. And that can be for a whole bunch of reasons. Maybe they've got unique natural resources, like, you know, think about India. They need crude oil.
Right.
Or it could be about having the right infrastructure, you know? So the U.S. might be able to take those raw ingredients from India and turn them into pharmaceuticals really efficiently.
Yeah, true.
Or it could even be about specialized knowledge, you know, like the expertise that the U.S., China, and Taiwan have in making semiconductors.
Yeah.
And this whole specialization thing, it means better quality goods at lower prices for everyone involved.
Right. So essentially tariffs are governments coming in and saying, okay, we're going to put a tax on these imported goods that are coming in.
Yeah, it's like a direct intervention.
Yeah. And that's a major way to create a trade barrier, right? It's up there with things like quotas. And so what happens is those imported products suddenly become more expensive. And if people really need those things, you know, what economists would call inelastic demand, meaning they'll buy them no matter what the price is.
Right, they're essential.
They might be stuck paying more for a domestic version, even if it's, you know, not as good or as cheap.
Yeah, it's limiting their choices in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all this stuff, you know, these taxes, these barriers, it all falls under the big umbrella of what they call foreign trade policy.
Right, foreign trade policy, yeah.
So that's the big picture. Now let's zoom in a little bit. What happens in the short term when these tariffs hit?
So in the short term, you tend to see a few things happen pretty quickly. One, imports go down, obviously, because they're more expensive.
Makes sense.
Two, domestic producers, you know, the companies within the country, they might ramp up their production to try and fill that gap. And then three, and this is a big one, consumers end up paying more.
Yeah. That's what hits people's wallets, right?
Exactly. It's that pocketbook impact that you really feel. So if you think about it like a supply and demand graph.
Okay. I vaguely remember those from Econ 101.
Right. Well, when you add a tariff, it pushes up the cost of those imported goods. So people buy less of them, and the local companies, they're encouraged to make more. But it's not a perfect, you know, one-for-one swap. And that leads to something called dead weight loss.
Dead weight loss. That sounds ominous.
Yeah, well, it basically means there's this inefficiency in the economy. You know, the domestic companies might end up overproducing stuff that people don't really need at that higher price, while at the same time, some people who would happily bought those cheaper imports, they're priced out of the market entirely.
So it's not just shifting things around. It's actually like shrinking the overall pie.
Exactly. Yeah, the pie gets smaller, which is never good.
And when those consumers are paying more, you know, that pretty quickly turns into inflation, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's not just some, you know, abstract concept. It hits people where it hurts in their wallets. Mm-hmm. And it especially impacts folks with lower incomes because they're spending a bigger chunk of their money on those essential things, the stuff they can't really cut back on.
Right. It's like food and housing and stuff.
Exactly. So in a way, tariffs can act like what economists call a regressive tax. It hurts the people who can least afford it.
Right. And then when people have less money to spend, the government often feels like they have to step in and provide more financial support.
Right. It's this ripple effect that goes beyond just the prices.
Yeah, for sure. Now, what's really interesting to me is this thing about tariffs on intermediate goods.
Oh, yeah, those are the sneaky ones.
Because that's where it seems like the inflation can really get amplified.
Yeah, exactly. So for folks who aren't familiar with the term intermediate goods, are things like steel semiconductors, fabric, the components that go into making other products.
Right. It's not the final product. It's the stuff that goes into it.
Exactly. And those intermediate goods, they make up something like 2/3 of global trade. So they're everywhere.
Wow.
I mean, they're in practically everything. So if you slap a tariff on steel, for example, well, it's not just the price of steel that goes up, right? It's cars, appliances, buildings, anything that uses steel.
It's like this chain reaction.
Yeah, it's like a cascade. These extra costs, they get passed along at every stage of production, and, each company along the way adds their own little profit margin.
Of course.
So by the time that final product gets to the consumer, the price hike can be way bigger than that initial tariff. It's like a tax that multiplies as it moves through the economy.
That's a great way to put it, a multiplying tax. So we've talked about these immediate impacts, but what about the longer-term arguments? Why do some people think tariffs might actually be a good thing in the long run?
Well, one of the classic arguments is the infant industry argument.
Okay, infant industry.
Yeah, the idea is that you've got these brand new industries popping up within a country, right? And they need a little bit of protection from those big global competitors that are already established. So tariffs, in this view, give those young companies some breathing room, some space to learn, grow, and eventually become strong enough to compete on their own in the international market.
Okay, so it's like giving them training wheels.
Exactly. And this often becomes a political issue, too, because there's this promise of, new jobs, a stronger local economy, all tied to protecting these fledgling industries.
Why is it appealing to voters?
Exactly. It's a very appealing narrative. But there's a pretty famous counterargument to this line of thinking, and it involves a rather illuminating example.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So let's go back to 1845 and this brilliant satire by a guy named Frederick Bastiat called the Candlemakers Petition.
Okay.
And in this satire, he basically says, hey, if we really want to create more light, boost the domestic candle industry, then the government should just block out the sun.
Block out the sun.
Yeah. I know it sounds crazy, but his point was that if we block out the sun, then the demand for candles will skyrocket, right?
Yeah.
But of course, that's ridiculous. Nobody wants to live in darkness.
Right.
And his real point was that protectionist measures like tariffs, they don't actually benefit the whole country. They mainly serve the interests of a small group, in his example, the candle makers,
Right.
at the expense of everyone else who'd much rather have, cheap sunlight.
Yeah, makes sense.
So by shielding domestic industries from competition, you're actually removing their incentive to innovate and become more efficient.
So they become complacent.
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of problems, cozy relationships between businesses and the government, tons of lobbying, and even an oversupply of those protected products globally.
So it's almost like the very thing that's supposed to help them grow up strong is actually keeping them weak and dependent.
Right. It's a bit of a paradox.
Right.
And there's actually data to back this up.
Right.
A 2019 study by Fursery and others found that on average, increasing tariffs actually leads to a 0.4% decrease in economic output growth over 5 years.
Wow. So it's actually hurting growth.
Yeah, not exactly a recipe for long-term success.
Yeah.
And when you look at this whole job creation argument, which is often a big selling point for tariffs, the reality can be quite different.
Yeah, how so?
Well, take the 2018 U.S. steel tariff, for example. Studies suggest that it actually resulted in something like 75,000 lost jobs.
75,000 lost jobs.
Yeah, in industries that use steel.
Sure.
And all that for the sake of creating maybe 1,000 new jobs in the steel industry itself.
So a net loss of jobs.
Yeah, a big one. And get this, those 1,000 steel jobs, they reportedly cost U.S. consumers a staggered $900,000 each.
$900,000 per job. That's
a lot of money.
That's mind-boggling, and it really highlights, the hidden costs that people don't always think about.
Right, the unseen consequences.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, if the economic arguments often fall short, what about the national security angle? I mean, we've definitely heard a lot about the need for countries to be self-reliant, especially in key industries.
Yeah, the national security argument has definitely gained traction recently, especially with the whole reliance on China thing for things like semiconductors and energy.
Right, China's a big player.
Huge player. And the idea is that, we need to ensure we've got a certain level of domestic production in those strategically important sectors, things we absolutely need. And we need to diversify our supply chain so we're not too vulnerable if something goes wrong.
So we're not putting all our eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And events like the U.S.-China trade war, the rising labor costs in China, the supply chain chaos during their zero COVID policy, all of that really highlighted these dependencies and made people nervous.
Right. It exposed those vulnerabilities.
For sure. And that's what's led to this concept of friendshoring, where companies are trying to move their manufacturing to countries that are more politically aligned with them, like Vietnam and India. Part of this whole China plus one strategy.
China plus one, okay.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, we still need China, but let's not rely on them entirely. Let's have a backup plan.
Like a plan B.
Exactly. But even this shift, this friendshoring thing, it comes with its own set of challenges. Logistical infrastructure, you name it.
Yeah. It's not a simple fix.
Definitely not. And it seems like the countries being targeted by these tariffs, they're not just sitting back and taking it.
No, they're adapting, right?
Exactly. There's evidence that China's been getting pretty clever about this. They've been rerouting products that are meant for the U.S. through these third countries like Mexico and Vietnam.
Oh, so they're finding loopholes.
Yeah, in a way. And they're making big investments in new production facilities in those countries, too. So you take telecom equipment, for example. A big chunk of the value might be added in China, but then the final assembly happens in a Chinese-owned factory in Vietnam, and then it gets shipped to the U.S.
So it's like a shell game.
Kinda, yeah. The label might say made in Vietnam, but the underlying reality is much more complex.
Wow, that's fascinating. And then on top of that, you've got the U.S. putting pressure on these countries.
Yeah.
Mexico, Vietnam, Canada, saying, hey, you need to impose your own tariffs on China.
Right. It's like they're trying to build this anti-China alliance.
Exactly. And of course, Canada's already hit back with some counter tariffs.
Yeah, so it's this tit-for-tat thing that could easily spiral out of control.
It's like a trade war brewing.
It is. And this kind of escalating chain of tariffs, it's a real threat to the whole system of free trade, the thing we were talking about at the beginning.
And it seems like, even if the desire for national security is understandable, tariffs might not be the best way to achieve it.
Right. I mean, for those really critical resources, like you were saying, we need to have a backup plan. Maybe maintaining strategic stockpiles would be a more direct and efficient approach than trying to prop up domestic industries that aren't naturally competitive.
Right. If it's not something we're already good at producing, maybe it's not worth forcing it.
Exactly. And the other thing is that this whole protectionism thing, it can create an environment where lobbying efforts become more important than actual innovation.
So companies are spending more time trying to influence the government than they are trying to improve their products.
Exactly. And think about those cutting-edge fields like AI and supercomputers. Those thrive on open competition and the free exchange of ideas.
Right. It's all about pushing the boundaries.
Yeah. And we've seen that with companies like DeepSeek. They're pushing the boundaries because they have to. But if you try to wall off domestic markets, it can stifle that crucial innovation.
So it's like you're trying to protect one part of the economy, but you might actually be holding back growth in other areas that are even more important.
Exactly. It's short-sighted.
Yeah.
And we saw a similar thing happen back in the 70s and 80s in the U.S. when they slapped tariffs on foreign cars.
Right, the whole Protect Detroit thing.
Exactly. But instead of revitalizing the domestic auto industry, it was the Japanese and German automakers that ended up outperforming the U.S. companies.
Yeah.
They were the ones innovating and producing those fuel-efficient cars that people actually wanted.
Right. They were ahead of the curve.
Yeah. And there's also this argument that strong trade ties between countries can actually reduce geopolitical tensions.
Oh, interesting. So it's like the more we trade, the less likely we are to fight.
Exactly. It's this idea that economic interdependence promotes peace. And it makes sense, right? If you're deeply connected economically, you're less likely to want to go to war with each other.
Yeah, you'd be hurting yourself.
Exactly. Now, what about this argument that we often hear that tariffs are needed to fix trade deficits?
Right. We hear that one a lot.
Yeah, well, the idea that tariffs can just magically eliminate trade deficits is a bit of a misunderstanding. Trade deficits can actually be a sign that a country is attracting foreign investment, money from overseas flowing in to fund domestic opportunities.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. And also, if a country like the U.S. exports less merchandise compared to, say, Germany or China, it's not always because of those other countries' tariffs. It can also reflect, limitations on the U.S. side, like supply chain issues or other things that are preventing those domestic industries from really scaling up their production.
So it's more complex than just saying, oh, it's those other countries' fault.
Much more complex. And then you've got the whole issue of retaliatory tariffs, the U.S. and the EU putting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and batteries.
Right, it's like a back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. And does that really solve anything? Well, Milton Friedman had a really interesting perspective on this. He said even without those retaliatory tariffs, if China sells more EVs, the money they earn is probably going to find its way back into the U.S. economy somehow, whether it's through buying American goods and services or investing in the U.S. in some other way.
So it's like the money just circulates anyway.
Yeah, in today's global economy, money has a way of finding its way around.
That's a good point. So let's take a look back at history. Have tariffs generally been a successful tool?
Well, the historical record is pretty mixed. It offers some valuable lessons, but they're often cautionary tales.
Okay, like what?
Well, in the late 19th century, U.S., during the Gilded Age, you had these industries that were heavily protected by tariffs, like textiles and chemicals. And guess what? They often showed lower rates of productivity growth compared to sectors that actually faced international competition.
So competition was actually a good thing.
Yeah, seems like it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most striking examples is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's pretty infamous. Most economists agree that this act, which dramatically increased tariffs on a whole bunch of imports, actually made the Great Depression a whole lot worse.
Wow.
It triggered retaliatory tariffs from other countries and caused this massive collapse in global trade.
So it backfired spectacularly.
Yeah, big time. And it was such a disaster that it really led to this long period of moving away from protectionist trade policies in the U.S. And that lasted until fairly recently, around 2018.
What about the rest of the world? What happened after World War II?
Well, after World War II, a lot of countries went in a different direction with trade. A lot of those newly independent nations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they adopted protectionist policies.
Okay, why was that?
Well, there were a few reasons. One was the influence of these economic theories like Keynesianism and dependency theory. And then there was a strategy called import substitution industrialization. And the goal was to, reduce their reliance on those former colonial powers.
Like they wanted to stand on their own 2 feet.
Exactly. So big countries like India and China, they put up these significant tariff barriers to protect their domestic markets.
Okay.
But then you had smaller nations like South Korea and Singapore, and they took a totally different approach. They embraced export-led growth through free trade, and they achieved some pretty remarkable economic success.
So different paths, different outcomes.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at why that happened. So in a lot of those newly independent countries, the initial focus was on building up their own consumption and exporting raw materials.
Right, kind of like starting with what they had.
Exactly, but there's this thing called the resource curse.
Resource curse, what's that?
Well, it's this idea that countries that rely heavily on exporting raw materials, they can actually end up worse off.
How so?
Well, the prices of those raw materials, they tend to fluctuate a lot, and they often fall relative to the prices of manufactured goods.
So they're at the mercy of the global market.
Exactly. And this can lead to all sorts of problems like worsening terms of trade and balance of payments, crises.
So it's not a sustainable long-term strategy.
Right. And this is one of the reasons why some of those countries tried to do more import substitution while others started to open up their trade policies. And it all kind of contributed to the relatively high average tariff levels we see in a lot of these countries today.
And those early choices have had lasting effects, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can see it in countries like India, which still has a fairly high average tariff rate, around 15%.
And what's been the impact of that?
Well, that protection of those key manufacturing sectors, it led to this early shift towards the service sector in the 1980s. And while the service sector did grow, it wasn't as effective at creating jobs as a strong manufacturing base might have been.
So they kind of jumped ahead to services without building up that manufacturing foundation.
Exactly. And it also contributed to rising income inequality, which, potentially exacerbated some of those existing social divisions.
Right. So it's not just about the economics, it's about the social impact as well.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. So we've talked a lot about tariffs, but let's shift gears for a second and talk about subsidies. Because sometimes subsidies are presented as this, more palatable form of government intervention.
Right. Like it's not as bad as a tariff.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the real difference between the two? Well, fundamentally, both tariffs and subsidies are forms of protectionism.
Okay.
And they both disrupt that natural efficiency of free markets, but the main difference is in how the cost is distributed.
Okay, explain that.
So with tariffs, the consumer pays more directly. They see it on the price tag at the store. But with subsidies, the cost is spread out across all taxpayers through government funding. So instead of a higher price on a specific item, you might just have a slightly higher tax bill overall.
So it's less visible, but it's still there.
Exactly. It's like a hidden cost. And the thing is, subsidies can also cause problems on the international stage.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Just like tariff subsidies can trigger trade disputes and even lead to trade wars.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, take the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. They provide huge subsidies to European farmers, and it's been a major source of overproduction and tension in international trade.
Right. It's like they're tilting the playing field.
Exactly. And then you've got those ongoing disputes between the U.S. and the EU over subsidies to Boeing and Airbus.
Oh, yeah, those have been going on forever.
Right. It just shows you how these subsidies can create huge international conflicts. And sometimes governments even use subsidies as a Band-Aid solution, to try and fix the problems that their own tariffs created.
Oh, interesting. So it's like one wrong trying to cover up another wrong?
Exactly. So they might offer subsidies to domestic companies to help them absorb the higher cost of those imported components that are now subject to tariffs. Or they might use subsidies to make up for things like bad infrastructure or too many regulations.
So it's like this vicious cycle.
It can be. And in the end, it's always the taxpayers who end up footing the bill. Even if they don't benefit directly from those subsidized products or industries.
Right. It's like this hidden tax.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, going back to what we were talking about earlier with Milton Friedman, he had this really clever way of illustrating the absurdity of tariffs.
Right. He was a master of using examples.
He really was. So in a 1978 speech at the University of Utah, he said, imagine trying to grow bananas in hothouses in Logan, Utah.
Bananas in Utah.
Yeah, I know it sounds crazy. But he said if you slapped a high enough tariff on imported bananas, it might actually become economically feasible to grow them domestically, create a few jobs in the process. But his point was, would that make any sense? I mean, if it's clearly ridiculous to restrict the import of bananas in a place that's just not suited for it, then why would we do the same thing with something like steel, where global trade is clearly the more efficient and cost-effective option?
Right. It's picking winners and losers.
Exactly. And it's often doing it for political reasons rather than economic ones.
So to kind of sum up everything we talked about today, tariffs have these immediate impacts like reducing imports and driving up inflation. And then those long-term arguments for tariffs, the whole protecting new industries and boosting national security, those often have these hidden drawbacks and unintended consequences.
Right, and history is full of these cautionary tales, from the disaster of Smoot-Hawley to the varied experiences of those post-colonial nations. And it's important to remember that both tariffs and subsidies, they're both forms of protectionism, and they ultimately interfere with free markets and impose costs on either consumers or taxpayers.
And it's like at the end of the day, it's regular people who pay the price.
Right. And that's something that's often lost in these discussions. So to leave you with a final thought to ponder, as we navigate this increasingly complex global economy, what does protection really mean in the 21st century? And are we sacrificing innovation and overall prosperity in the name of protection? I encourage you to look around and see these tariffs in action and really think about those consequences that aren't always so obvious.
Yeah, it's about looking beyond the surface and understanding the deeper impacts. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into tariffs and subsidies.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been